Citizenship on the Go. Lesson 5. American History. International Wars. Part 1. The War of 1812. This lesson outlines several notable wars fought by the United States in the 1800s and 1900s. It names some people in U.S. government who were involved in these wars, including U.S. presidents who served as commander-in-chief of the military during major political crises. It highlights a few reasons for U.S. participation in international conflicts during the 1800s and the 1900s, and it discusses some of the ways this country's foreign relationships, territorial claims, and laws have changed over time as a result of war. The United States fought in multiple wars in the 1800s. The biggest wars in which the American military participated during the 19th century were the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. Of these four wars, the one with the highest American death toll was the Civil War, which was fought between states in the north of the U.S. and states in the south of the U.S. due to fierce disagreements over the problem of slavery. Abraham Lincoln was the President of the United States during the Civil War. Since Lincoln wanted to restrict slavery in the USA, many states that wanted to keep slavery legal forever announced they were leaving the Union when Lincoln won the presidential election. States in the South that said they should have the right to keep slavery fought to leave the United States. States in the North that were against splitting the United States into two separate nations fought to keep the Union together. Because the Civil War was fought between the northern states and southern states, it's also called the War Between the States. Since the North won the war between the states, the country did not split in two. The federal government made slavery illegal everywhere in the United States shortly after the war ended. The War Between the States, or Civil War, is different from other wars fought by the United States in the 1800s. The two sides in the Civil War, the North and the South, were both parts of the same country. For that reason, the Civil War is not considered an international war. By contrast, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War are international wars. In these wars, the United States fought against other nations of the world, such as Great Britain, Mexico, and Spain. Problems that led to the Civil War included economic differences between the North and the South, disagreements about slavery, and differing views on states' rights. Issues that led the U.S. into international wars in the 1800s, on the other hand, were mostly related to disputes about borders between countries and arguments over different governments' territorial claims. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War were fought to protect U.S. claims, to expand U.S. territory, to increase U.S. influence, and to defend U.S. sovereignty, among other reasons. Each of these wars had a major impact on the way the U.S. looks on a map today. Large pieces of land that had previously been under British, Mexican, or Spanish control were added to the U.S. in connection with these conflicts. Civics Test Question. Name the war between the North and the South. Name the war between the North and the South. The Civil War. The war fought in the 1800s between the north of the United States and the south of the United States is usually called the Civil War. Another name for the Civil War is the War Between the States. Civics test question. Name one problem that led to the Civil War. Name one problem that led to the Civil War. Slavery. Disagreements about slavery were a major cause of the fighting between the North and the South during the Civil War. There were economic reasons for many of the arguments about whether slavery should be abolished throughout the country. A topic often addressed in these arguments was states' rights to make their own laws. After the United States won its independence from Britain in the 1700s, it started building an official national military. The first large international conflict fought by the brand new U.S. military was the War of 1812, in which American soldiers were up against British soldiers once again. Despite its name, the War of 1812 lasted more than 1 year. Much of the fighting took place on the water, as the American and the British navies battled each other using gunships. Combat in the War of 1812 also happened on land, in the United States and in Canada. At the time, Canada was still a part of the British Empire. Some battles of the War of 1812 were fought far from the Canadian border, including in the United States capital city, Washington, D.C. Most of the fighting, however, occurred on or very near the border between the eastern United States and Canada. In the War of 1812, all through the Great Lakes region of North America, the U.S. military clashed with the British Canadian military. The U.S. Army also fought against coalitions of American Indian tribes allied with the British at this time. Since long before the Europeans arrived, people of many tribes had lived in the area where the U.S.-Canada border was eventually created. Some made deals with the British to try to protect their lands. Many Shawnee and Mohawk warriors, for example, allied with the British in the early 1800s and battled troops of U.S. soldiers throughout the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, the border between the United States and Canada did not yet stretch from coast to coast. It started at the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast, with what we now know as the state of Maine, and it continued westward along the northern limits of New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. Beyond that, the limit between Canada to the north and the U.S. to the south was largely up for debate. Today, the U.S.-Canada border stretches far beyond Michigan, reaching all the way to the Pacific Ocean. States that border Canada now include Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington. Another state that borders Canada in the modern day is Alaska. Alaska is located farther north than any other U.S. state. It's also the largest state of the United States. The border between Alaska and Canada is one of the longest continuous international land boundaries in the world. Civics test question. Name one state that borders Canada. Name one state that borders Canada. New York. New York is one state that borders Canada. The 13 states that border Canada in the present day are Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, Washington, and Alaska. Civics test question. Who lived in America before the Europeans arrived? Who lived in America before the Europeans arrived? Native Americans. Before the British, French, and other Europeans came to North America, Native Americans, or American Indians, were already living throughout the continent. American Indian tribes were frequently pulled into European conflicts, including the War of 1812. In the 1700s, when the U.S. gained its independence from Britain, it was a much smaller nation than it is today. There were just 13 original colonies that became states when the U.S. government was first set up. Most of the earliest versions of the U.S. flag had 13 stars and 13 stripes to represent these 13 original colonies. By 1812, however, a couple more states had been added to the USA. During much of the War of 1812, the American flag had 15 stars and 15 stripes. As time went on, the U.S. expanded to include 50 states. The flag today has 50 stars to represent the 50 states. The flag doesn't have 50 stripes, however. It has 13. The modern U.S. flag has 13 stripes to remind us that there were 13 original colonies: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Civics test question. Why does the flag have 13 stripes? Why does the flag have 13 stripes? Because there were 13 original colonies. There are 13 stripes on the flag of the United States today because the stripes represent the original colonies. Civics test question. There were 13 original states. Name 3. There were 13 original states. Name 3. Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Virginia. Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Virginia are 3 of the 13 original states. The other original states are New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. There were many reasons for the War of 1812. One big issue was a practice called impressment. In the early 1800s, the British Navy frequently captured American sailors and pressed them, or forced them to work, on British ships. The British Navy needed more soldiers at the time for a huge war the British were fighting against France. Even though the British government officially recognized the U.S. as an independent nation after the Revolutionary War, the British Navy was not concerned with the rights of U.S. citizens. Many British military officers continued to view Americans as traitors to the empire. The relationship between the U.S. and Britain was also in a bad place because the U.S. government and U.S. companies were making deals with the French government and French companies at the same time that Britain was warring with France. Britain blockaded American ports to try to keep the U.S. from doing overseas business with France, and sailors on American merchant ships were a common target for impressment. Tensions between Britain and the USA in the 19th century were also heightened by the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, when Thomas Jefferson was president, the U.S. government negotiated with France to buy a huge piece of land in North America called Louisiana, or the Louisiana Territory. The USA's purchase of the Louisiana Territory gave the French military more money to spend on the war they were fighting in Europe. This angered Britain. In the eyes of the U.S. government, however, the Louisiana Purchase was an excellent deal. Acquiring the Louisiana Territory doubled the size of the United States. It also gave the U.S. control of the 2 largest rivers in North America. The Missouri River flows west to east through a large part of the Louisiana Territory until it meets with the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River flows north to south, starting close to the Canadian border and reaching all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, now also known as the Gulf of America. Expanding the United States to include the Missouri and the Mississippi gave the country access to much more land, water, and other natural resources than it had had up to that point. The large increase in national possessions made the British government concerned that the U.S. might try to grow even larger, pushing its borders northward into British Canada. When settlers from the eastern USA started moving into Louisiana, the British military made alliances with Native American tribes in the area, giving weapons to warriors from nations such as the Seneca, Shawnee, and Creek, and encouraging them to attack American settlements. These conflicts also fed into the War of 1812. Years later, after the war ended, many of the Native American tribes that had been allied with Britain were forced into reservations west of the Mississippi River. Civics test question. What territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? What territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? Louisiana. The United States bought Louisiana, or the Louisiana Territory, from France in 1803. Civics test question. Name one of the two longest rivers in the United States. Name one of the two longest rivers in the United States. The Mississippi. The two longest rivers in the United States are the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. Tensions between Britain and the U.S. reached their height when James Madison was President of the United States. Madison had become famous early on in U.S. politics as one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. Like fellow Federalists Hamilton and Jay, Madison believed that the United States needed to have a strong central government if it was going to survive as a country. He wrote essays to support the passage of the U.S. Constitution, which set up a powerful federal government and defined the roles the different branches of government would play. When the British blockaded U.S. ports, encouraged Native American groups to attack U.S. settlers in Louisiana, and forced U.S. sailors to work on British ships, Madison believed the federal government needed to take a very powerful stand against these actions. He asked Congress to declare war on Britain. A majority of senators and representatives agreed. Congress declared war, and the War of 1812 began. All three branches of federal government are based in the nation's capital. When the federal government declared war in 1812, President Madison, the members of the Senate, and the members of the House of Representatives were working in the capital city. For a short period of U.S. history, New York City had been the nation's capital. By the time Madison was elected president, however, the capital had been moved farther south, to where it is today. The capital of the United States, all through the 1800s, was Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is still the U.S. capital now. D.C. is not a state. Instead, it's a district. D.C. stands for District of Columbia, with Columbia being an old poetic name for the Americas. The Washington part of the capital's name was created in honor of George Washington, the first president of the United States and the father of our country. During the War of 1812, the British military invaded the capital. President Madison and other government officials were forced to flee. The White House and the Capitol building were burned down. The United States took the city back shortly afterward and restored D.C. as the nation's capital, but rebuilding was costly. Throughout the war, The US Navy and the British Navy also fought all over the Atlantic Ocean, which lies off the east coast of the United States. Some of the battles were won by the United States, and others were won by Britain. There was no clear overall winner. For both sides, the war was very expensive and difficult to maintain. After a few years, President Madison signed a treaty with Britain, confirming the location of the border between the US and Canada. The Senate approved the treaty, Britain ended their blockade, and the war was officially over. Civics test question. What ocean is on the east coast of the United States? What ocean is on the east coast of the United States? The Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean is on the east coast of the United States. Civics test question. The Federalist Papers supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution. Name one of the writers. The Federalist Papers supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution. Name one of the writers. Madison. One of the writers of the Federalist Papers is James Madison. The three authors of the Federalist Papers were James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. However, most of the essays were published under the name Publius. Civics test question. What is the capital of the United States? What is the capital of the United States? Washington, D.C. Even though large parts of Washington, D.C. were burned down during the War of 1812, the U.S. government decided to keep the capital where it was, in the District of Columbia, and rebuild what had been destroyed. Washington, D.C. is still the capital of the United States today. One of the most famous things to come out of the War of 1812 is a poem called The Star-Spangled Banner. During one of the battles of the War of 1812, the British Navy bombarded a fort near Baltimore, trying to invade the state of Maryland. The U.S. Navy fought back. While this was happening, an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key was trapped on a British ship. Key had come to argue for the release of an American civilian he believed the British had wrongfully arrested. While Key was presenting his arguments to British military officials, however, the bombardment began. Key was told he would have to remain aboard the British ship until the battle was over. For more than 24 hours, Key waited anxiously to see who would win the battle. Since he was American, no one on the British ship where he was trapped would give him any information about what was happening. Key's only sign that the battle was not over yet was the sight of the U.S. banner, or flag, flying over the fort that was under attack. As long as the flag was still flying, Key knew that the U.S. had not been defeated or given up the fight. The U.S. military successfully defended the fort, winning the battle. The Star-Spangled Banner that Key had been watching so anxiously all through the night and into the morning stayed up. After Key was finally allowed to leave the British ship, he wrote a poem about his experience. The Star-Spangled Banner became very popular throughout the United States. For many Americans, the poem came to act as much more than a reminder of fighting during the War of 1812. The words were set to music, and many years later, Congress officially made the Star-Spangled Banner the U.S. national anthem. The national anthem has 3 verses, but usually people only sing the first verse. Though the first verse describes an event from a war long ago, Key's words have come to take on broader symbolic meaning for many people. The Star Spangled Banner is considered an inspiring reminder that even though Americans have faced great difficulties in war and out of war, the people of this country have not yet given up on fighting for what matters to them. There are still many Americans today fighting for freedom, self government, and other ideas the U.S. flag and the national anthem can be seen to represent. You'll often hear the first verse of the Star Spangled Banner sung at patriotic events, on holidays like Memorial Day or Veterans Day, or even at the opening of sports events. Today, the national anthem holds even greater meaning for many people in this country than it did when Key first wrote the words. Civics Test Question: what is the name of the national anthem? What is the name of the national anthem? The Star Spangled Banner. The name of the national anthem of the United States of America is the Star Spangled Banner.